So we've talked about the nature of compassion, what it is, how it manifests, what causes it to arise. We've talked about the near and far enemies of compassion, proper attitude towards both generating compassion and what can get in the way. I want to shift gears a little bit tonight, this afternoon for you, to speak about not just the barriers, which we talked about last night, the things that get in the way, but to focus a little bit on qualities that interact to allow us to both have and to increase this capacity for connection. Particularly, I'm talking tonight about sati, mindfulness, and a little bit about the interaction between compassion and some of the other Brahmaviharas. We tend to speak about mind states as unitary things, separate things, but very practically, in our experience, a state of mind has many associated conditions, mind states arising within it. The Abhidhamma speaks of chitta, mind, and cetasika, which are mind states. So each moment of mind, each chitta, has a number of different associated mind states. And these all work together and interact. So you can talk about them one at a time, but functionally and very practically, they never act that way. They never act alone. So when we do a practice like Karuna Bhavana, when we are cultivating compassion, this involves developing and purifying the mind, and developing and purifying many, many different mind states. So some of them may be well in the background, but it's really important to know that they're there and that they're really important. I want to particularly speak at the beginning about mindfulness because you cannot develop any of the Brahma Viharas, not Metta, not Karuna, not Mudita, not Upekkha, without sati, without mindfulness. But unlike in Vipassana practice, when mindfulness is our primary tool, in these practices, mindfulness is very much in the background. So when we speak about connection, that word implies mindfulness. Anytime we connect with something and really know what we're saying or what we're thinking or what we're intending, there's mindfulness there. So can we be aware of the other person's suffering, what we wish for this other person, this phrase we're using? And then, of course, what secondary reactions are happening in the heart around all of that. So while this is a concentration practice, you are really developing quite a lot of mindfulness when you do it, but just not directly, indirectly. And often people who do a lot of Vipassana practice, they especially at the beginning of a metta retreat, if they haven't done that before, the question always arises that, I'm so used to doing Vipassana and the mind just wants to be mindful. I'm afraid this is going to get in the way of that. I'm afraid this is, going to have some negative effect on my practice. There are often doubts about this concentration practice because people are afraid that the Vipassana will suffer. But in fact, I think of it like I used to be a triathlete. I think of it like cross training.
What?
So instead of cross training, it's like instead of if you're training for a marathon, you go swim in the pool to strengthen other aspects. So
okay.
You're not. So this is like we say in English, cross training for the mind. You strengthen the mindfulness by training for the mind to incline to compassion in this case. And I don't have to tell most of you how this changes your Vipassana practice for the better, because what it imparts to the Vipassana practice is the ability to connect and receive with kindness whatever arises. So woven through our development of compassion is the development of mindfulness and the polishing of our ability to be mindful. And you can't separate the two out. I mean, it's totally impossible. Likewise with the four Brahma Viharas. And I want to talk about this in part because a number of people have asked questions around using metta as opposed to cultivating compassion. Is this okay? And I say, yes, it's fine. So for context, the four Brahma Viharas, metta, compassion, or metta, loving kindness, karuna, compassion, mudita, empathetic joy, and upekkha, equanimity. So these four Brahma Viharas, just like I was just talking about with mindfulness, we cultivate them separately, but they work together. And when we develop each of them, there's actually not a whole lot of difference in technique. In each case, we have a sequence of categories of beings for whom we radiate that particular Brahma Vihara, starting where it's easy and going where it's harder. We use a phrase and we cultivate that particular Brahma Vihara by going through the series of categories and repeating the phrase over and over and over again for different beings in each category. So the differences are the sequence of the phrases. And of course, the phrase itself is going to differ. Metta is thought to be the foundational Brahma Viharas, the first one that's cultivated for a good reason. So metta is basic because it's basic well-wishing. It's basic wishes for the health and well-being of living, or the health and happiness of living beings. It's the more general, the most general of the first three Brahma Viharas. The second and third Brahma Viharas, karuna, this one that we're cultivating this week, and mudita, empathetic joy, are variants of metta, inclining in opposite directions. So metta, this well-wishing that inclines and focuses on the suffering of others, is compassion. Metta, this well-wishing that inclines and focuses on the good fortune of others, is mudita. So by cultivating metta, we're including both of these, but we're not focusing on either of them. And when we cultivate metta, when we say, may you be well, happy, and peaceful, that of course naturally implies that that being is not suffering. But we're not focusing on the suffering. We're just letting that be in the background. So we're not saying, may you be free of suffering. We're saying, may you be happy, which implies that you're free of suffering. And the same with mudita, with empathetic joy. So if you first cultivate metta so that the metta is strong and continuous, it's much easier then to cultivate compassion. As I said, I think yesterday or this morning, I lose track. Traditionally, when one cultivates these Brahma Viharas, one cultivates metta until what's said the barriers are broken down before one then goes on to compassion. And that phrase, having the barriers broken down, has a very specific meaning that I'll explain. So going through each of the categories, we notice the difference between the quality of heart in each category, especially early on in the practice. We can really tell there's a difference between the dear friend and the enemy, the dear friend and the neutral person. This is a manifestation of the impediments to that particular mind state. So, for example, the impediments to metta. So the metta for some categories can be very strong and weaker in others because of lobha, dosa, moha, greed, aversion, delusion. So as we purify, as we do the practice, as the purification happens, these impediments become attenuated or disappear altogether. And as we go from one category to the other, we build the metta and then switch and stay with this next category until the metta is strong again. And then we go to the next one and the next one. And then what happens is there's this beautiful evenness of mind. The metta is exactly the same from category to category to category. We can't tell the difference. So it's said that before you begin to cultivate compassion, you will have done this. And then we begin to cultivate compassion in the same way as with the metta, with different categories, and we go from one to the other. And if we had a longer period of time, we could stay with one category long enough so that everybody would be able to switch, and there would not be a whole lot of difference between the first category and the second one. So by breaking down the barriers, and we do this in the compassion practice as well, in the same way, by breaking down the barriers between these different categories of being, we're actually in the background developing equanimity. So each of the Brahma Viharas is actually developed as we develop one particular one. We prepare the ground by cultivating metta, as all of you have done. And then we begin to cultivate compassion, which, as I said, is just another manifestation of metta that focuses on misfortune, suffering, difficulty. And because we've already cultivated metta to some extent, and the more we've done it, the easier it is, it guards the mind from being partial, specifically because we've already cultivated to the extent that the barriers are broken down. That partiality is no longer so strong. And actually, to be quite specific, what I mean is when the barriers are broken down, that partiality is gone. But we may still have a basic habit of partiality that the mind may revert to when we're not practicing. So if we've done a lot of metta practice and been successful at that, and then sometime later we begin the compassion practice, having broken down the barriers once means it's much easier to do so with the compassion, but there may be the habit of preference that's there kind of in the background, that at the beginning of the compassion practice we need to work with. So when we focus on the compassion, we have this foundation of metta and this experience that we understand and remember of, oh yeah, the mind can have this even caring and well-wishing. And if we encounter difficulty in the compassion practice with preference, just as it, well, let me go back. I'll begin a sentence again. Just as with the metta practice, when we encounter some difficulty, we can go to an easier category. When we go to the compassion practice and we encounter a difficulty with preference, we have this extra place we can go, in other words, go to metta, that allows us some space from that difficulty. So we don't just have easier categories to go to, we also have an easier Brahma Vihara to go to. So several people have mentioned going back to metta or going to metta for themselves and wondering, is that okay? And absolutely, absolutely.
Va bene.
So it's not only further developing that foundation, but at the same time, because compassion is simply metta that focuses on suffering, you're actually not doing, you're developing compassion in the background when you're developing metta. So you're not doing something completely different. You're just focusing in a different way. You're not focusing so closely anymore on the suffering, but that's included in the metta, in the background. So these two, metta and compassion, are so close you can't really separate them. Also, mudita, to go on to the third one. So mudita is metta, as I've said, that focuses on good fortune. And what mudita can do, it's very useful, is to prevent us from being completely overwhelmed by the suffering of the world. So what's very useful if you find yourself getting overwhelmed by the heaviness of compassion is to do basic metta practice while bringing to mind the person for whom you're radiating metta, bringing them to mind in a happy state. So this balances out the heaviness of the compassion practice. You could even do specific mudita practice, which is even more focused in on that happiness, where you focus on somebody, just like with the compassion practice, you focus on somebody with misfortune. In mudita, you focus on somebody who's got, something good happening in their life. So, you focus on their good fortune and you say the basic phrase is, may your happiness and good fortune continue and increase. Doing mudita practice intensively can make you actually quite high. People can get a little whoa. It's a very happy practice. I mean, it's not without purification, but it definitely has a different flavor than this one. So you can actually go and do some mudita practice if things are really getting heavy, perhaps even using the same person for whom you're radiating compassion. So everybody has good fortune and misfortune. So remembering the good fortune of people, even with difficulties in their life, really helps the heart hold everything. Several years ago, a very dear friend of mine was dying of cancer, and she was so happy because she was completely surrounded by love. She was single, she didn't have a family, or not close family, but she was in a hospice and she was never alone. There was always somebody coming in the door, just to be with her. And people would go in there because of this love. I mean, it was quite remarkable. And there was so much love in that room. Everybody was happy in spite of this incredible sad passing that was happening. And from a Dhamma point of view, it was so beautiful because we know in our minds and intellectually, all conditioned things arise and pass away. But in that passing, in that letting go, this is where the suffering can arise. And it's the love, the metta, and the willingness to focus on the beauty of that and the good fortune of having that makes the letting go possible. So even in the saddest circumstances, there's beauty. And for some reason, as human beings, we find it very hard very hard to let that in, because we want to focus on the difficulty. So by kind of widening the lens to allow us to connect with the difficulty as we also connect with the beauty, this is what brings balance into the heart. And this balance is a manifestation of equanimity, this fourth Brahmavihara, where the mind isn't locking in on the negative or the positive, but rests right in the middle. So, as I said, when we break down the barriers as we're developing metta, karuna, mudita, upekkha, that's one manifestation of how equanimity is being developed in these practices. And the bigger picture is, because each of the Brahmaviharas, metta, karuna, mudita particularly, focus on suffering or happiness or metta in general, developing all three of those brings an even greater equanimity and balance. So just as when we cultivate metta, we are also cultivating mindfulness. In the same way, each of these Brahmaviharas is brought along when you cultivate a single one. And each Brahma Vihara supports and balances the others. So please know when you're doing this, you're not just cultivating compassion. And don't worry if you feel you need to turn the focus of the heart and the mind to metta in particular, to give you a greater sense of balance. This practice in particular of the four is actually one of the hardest to do, as we're doing it particularly, without months and months of metta right beforehand. It's really important that you not go to drowning in whatever reactions are coming up. So if you feel like you're going to overwhelm, stop. Take a moment to feel whatever is going on, and then go to particularly metta for yourself or for any other category of being that will allow you to regain your balance. This is not going backwards. This is just developing at the same time one of the other Brahma Viharas and bringing it into stronger focus. And particularly if maybe you're not feeling overwhelmed, but whatever resistance, if you're feeling resistance, if that resistance becomes stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger, don't push against that. So say you've been practicing all day and it's or for the last several days, since the resistance is just getting more intense. Go to cultivating compassion in the background by switching to metta practice. That resistance may be the mind saying, forget it, I'm not going there. I can't do it. It's never a good idea to force yourself to do anything in any meditative practice. It just doesn't work. And if there isn't the balance to really hold intense suffering, don't push it. This is metta for yourself and your mental health. And if you feel like you need to go to metta, please do that. Don't feel you're doing anything wrong. So I'll stop there and thank you for your kind attention.